On the wide and quiet campus of Columbia University, power was like an invisible thread woven through the halls, connecting glances, muffled laughs, and subtle gestures passed between students. Here, among the daily routines of kids who had always enjoyed a certain privilege, there was an unspoken order that nobody questioned. Folks just went along with things as they had always been, until one autumn morning when a newcomer shook things up. Her name was Sophia. Sophia walked through the rusted black gates, her old jacket hanging loosely on her shoulders. The fabric had faded from too many washes. As she hurried beneath the canopy of chestnut trees, she avoided the eager stares that tried to sort her out right away, as if the whole setting was a test she was already failing. To them, she stuck out in all the wrong ways, like a typo in a carefully edited essay. Instead of mingling with the rest by the main fountain, or trying to find a place in the scattered lunchtime groups, Sophia settled quietly over by the edge of the quad, half in and half out of the shadow of Butler Library. She set her backpack on the cement, sat down, and pulled out a battered notebook, intent on acting as if she belonged there, at least to herself. To everyone else, though, she quickly turned into the Shadow. The name slipped into whispered conversations, a label for someone who wouldn't play along. She didn't get nervous under the glances, nor did she try to please or retaliate. She just watched everything, which made people uneasy. Other students, used to reading a room and using that knowledge to maintain their own little pockets of influence, or to stay out of trouble, didn't know what to do with her. They expected her to either drop her eyes and move out of sight, or start acting out. But Sophia didn't do either, and the fact that she didn't fit into their routines of subtle intimidation and approval-seeking stirred up a quiet kind of irritation. Kids who thrived on that cycle of tension and rumor found that her silence made them more uncomfortable than any struggle for attention would have. In those first days, her presence alone became a question mark in everyone's day-to-day, a reminder that sometimes all it takes is one unbothered outsider to reveal how fragile the natural order really is. Out of everyone who walked Columbia University's ancient walkways and crowded dining halls, no one was more feared or secretly admired than Matthew Sinclair. Matthew wasn't just known for his sharp jawline or the polished look that seemed to run in the family. It was his last name that worked like a shield. His father's name was carved into plaques and stone buildings across campus, and everyone whispered about the foundations his family funded, as if the Sinclair money alone could decide what directions the university would take next. Whenever he appeared, students shifted out of his path, some out of sheer awe, most out of quiet fear, and others out of hope that maybe, if they were seen by him, they'd be allowed into his circle. Matthew didn't need to make a scene. He almost never raised his voice. In fact, he seemed to prefer letting a sarcastic comment slip quietly between his teeth. It was his trademark move, one cutting remark, timed perfectly in a crowded hallway or just outside the John Jay dining hall, and suddenly someone's day could unravel. Sometimes it was as subtle as a shoulder turned abruptly to block someone's path, forcing them to hesitate, exposing their unease for everyone to see. He never got caught bullying outright. His power was more refined, built up by generations of privilege, and maintained through an unwritten set of rules that only he seemed to truly understand. People following him around seemed to do it like it was second nature, not because he demanded it, but because it was simply expected. Some students wanted to draw his attention for the chance at protection, or just to be part of that influential orbit. Others wisely tried to avoid getting noticed. The rumor was that Matthew knew how to get what he wanted, from reserved tables at the library during finals to recommendations from professors who were suddenly much more flexible with their grading. Most of the time, Matthew wore a controlled smile, the kind that gave away nothing and invited even less. Nobody dared to cross him. With a few careful words, and without ever lifting a finger, he could rearrange the social hierarchy by lunchtime, all while keeping his hands clean in the eyes of the administration. Underneath all the politeness was a brand of cruelty so polished it hardly looked like cruelty at all. That was what made him so dangerous, and why, as people glanced over their shoulders, nobody was ever sure if they were in his good graces or on the edge of being quietly shut out. From the moment Sophia first walked across Columbia's quad, she could feel the invisible barrier around her. Most people pretended. She wasn't there, turning away or suddenly finding their phones interesting whenever she came close. The seating in classrooms and at the library seemed carefully arranged to keep a few empty chairs between Sophia and everyone else. It wasn't a quite open hostility, but the message was obvious. She didn't belong, and it was easier for everyone to ignore her and avoid drawing Matthew Sinclair's attention. Sophia made it a habit to pick the most distant spot in a room, tucked away, in the farthest corner or along the edge of the library's quietest floor. She figured keeping to herself reduced the odds of catching someone's eye in the wrong way, especially Matthew's or any of his friends. But while it meant she never became an easy target for direct jokes or confrontational stares, it also left her completely on her own. Her silence became its own kind of shield, but what other people saw was a sign of weakness or fear. They whispered about her behind her back, conjuring up stories about where she lived, how she must have gotten in, or what favor she had called in just to set foot on campus. The rumors rarely ended there. She heard sideways comments about scholarships, about how kids like her were ruining the legacy feel of the school. Sometimes a group would walk by and drop words just loud enough for her to catch, like charity case or quota. Sophia clenched her jaw, refusing to show even a flicker of hurt. She wouldn't let anyone see her dignity waver. Instead of snapping back or trying to win them over, she listened. Every day she watched carefully. Who sat together at lunch, who avoided which hallways at which times, who delivered cruel remarks, and who just laughed along, maybe out of unease. Sophia started to notice patterns no one else seemed to catch. She could tell which members of Matthew's circle pushed the rumors hardest, which ones only played along, and which tried, however quietly, to keep their distance from the drama. Her silence, mistaken by others for defeat, was actually her way of building a mental map of how things worked. While the rest of the campus stayed busy, ranking each other, Sophia's quiet observation became her secret weapon. In a place where appearances ruled, she realized that knowing who really pulled the strings was more powerful than any argument. The first real encounter between Matthew and Sophia happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon, just outside Hamilton Hall. Most of the students hurried past with their hoods up or umbrellas clutched close, but Sophia seemed to move slower than the rest, her backpack protecting her from the drizzle. As she made her way along the slippery path, she bumped into Matthew, literally. He stood with two of his closest friends in the middle of everyone's way, as if the campus itself had been built to serve as his private stage. Most people knew better than to walk anywhere near Matthew without offering a quick nod or, at the very least, lowering their gaze. But Sophia looked him right in the eyes. The pause that hung between them was thick, longer than anyone else would have dared to allow. It caught Matthew off guard. He was used to people shrinking back when he stood his ground. For a second, he held her stare, trying to read her. A mistake, maybe, for someone so used to having the last word before anyone else even said a thing. Matthew's first reaction was a mix of annoyance and a strange sort of interest. Sophia wasn't new to getting dismissive glances, but this kind of exchange was different. Usually, a person's refusal to look away got silenced with one of Matthew's well-placed remarks. But Sophia didn't flinch, didn't utter a word. The challenge in her eyes made his blood run hotter than he cared to admit. From that afternoon on, something changed. Matthew, who rarely wasted time on anyone outside his circle, started noticing Sophia in places he never had before. The back of the lecture hall, sitting alone near low library's stone steps, sometimes merely watching. Her independence, far from fading away, only seemed to grow. For Matthew, it became a personal mission to show everyone that nobody got to defy him, especially not someone with nothing to lose and no one to stand with her. So Matthew started with small provocations. In the lunch line, he'd cut ahead. Just as she neared the front, he'd block her locker with whispers and laughter, making sure she knew he was in control. Each little test was meant to chip away at Sophia's composure, but she never gave him what he wanted. Matthew's irritation hardened into determination. Now it wasn't just about him, it was about keeping the hierarchy. That was the story everyone else followed. If Sophia could walk through Columbia's halls untouched, what message would that send? For him, bending the shadow wasn't just a game. It was necessary to prove his claim as the quiet king of their world. As days passed, Matthew began to push harder, slipping back into the same tactics he had used for years to keep his standing. He blocked Sophia's path in the middle of crowded hallways, making her pause just long enough for everyone around to see that he controlled who moved and who waited. He started, spinning nicknames, letting them float through whispered conversations or tucked into lazy group chats, hoping one would stick. Sometimes his jokes went from the usual mean to just plain cruel, coated in a layer of sarcasm, but biting all the same. He made comments about her background, carefully code-switching so that what he said could always be passed off as a joke if anyone questioned him. Those around him gave nervous laughs, more worried about keeping their spot in Matthew's orbit than about the whispers they were echoing. But Sophia took it all in stride. Whenever a small crowd started to gather, she would quietly pick up her books, slide her notebooks into her bag, and step out of the circle of attention. Her face didn't show much. She didn't fight back or cry in public, and she sure didn't tiptoe around Matthew's provocations. Instead, she acted as if his efforts were a light breeze that could barely rustle her hair. Sometimes she even caught someone else's anxiety-filled look and managed the tightest half-smile, as if to say, "It's fine, this will pass too." Her distance frustrated Matthew more than if she had shouted back or given him the audience. He wanted. What Matthew didn't realize was that his old tricks just weren't landing like they once did. He was expecting that familiar cycle. He'd make a scene, people around would laugh, and the target would fall in line. But Sophia's refusal to react, her silent strength, shook him. Each time she remained calm, it was like she turned a mirror on him, and for the first time, Matthew had to face the fact that maybe all his influence meant less than he believed. The power he held over a room cracked a little each time she walked away, unimpressed. His patience wore thin. What was supposed to be a simple show of dominance started to gnaw at him. It was as if Sophia's calm was a silent dare, a message that nothing he did with words or stares could get to her. And every time he failed to get a response, the uneasy laughter of his friends felt more forced, more unsure of who they were clapping for. As Matthew kept raising the stakes, Sophia's quiet strength only grew more noticeable. The more he tried to corner her, the less she seemed to care, and that drove him up the wall. To everyone watching, her silence became a kind of discomfort they couldn't ignore. It made the air heavy, as if everyone was waiting to see which one of them would break first. It wasn't what people were used to. The normal reaction to fold, apologize, or disappear never came from Sophia. She just stood there or walked on, barely acknowledging the drama stirring around her. For Matthew, this indifference felt like the biggest insult. He had always counted on fear or embarrassment to keep control. But every time Sophia didn't react, it was like she was showing everyone that his power only worked if you played along. Other students who used to treat Matthew's games as unchangeable facts of life, started to look at him differently. Some of them would cringe when he went too far. Whispers in the hallway changed from, "Did you see what Matthew did?" to, "Do you think he's going to give up?" The ground under his feet wasn't as firm as before. Meanwhile, Sophia wasn't just ignoring everything out of stubbornness. Under that calm surface, she was always watching for the moment when things might cross a line that couldn't be taken back. She knew if she reacted too soon or too loud, Matthew would get exactly what he wanted, proof he could shake her and an excuse to escalate things even further. Her strategy was simple. As long as possible, she would let the game run its course, absorbing each move, making it clear his words and gestures had no effect. This standoff didn't happen in a vacuum. Teachers and other students noticed when Sophia kept her cool while rumors spread or jokes landed inches from cruel. They saw Matthew's frustration turn into something desperate. The dynamic on campus shifted just a little. A few people started to wonder if those unwritten rules everyone had accepted for years were really set in stone, or if maybe they existed only because everyone let them. Sophia's patience was calculated. She would know if and when that moment came, the one where Matthew crossed a boundary that demanded a response. Until then, her silence, far from weakness, was her way of quietly rewriting the rules herself. What nobody at Columbia realized was that Sophia's quiet resilience had roots that ran much deeper than a rough semester or a mean hallway moment. Before she arrived at the university, she had lived through things that most students there would never have to think about. Her father, Kevin Sawyer, was a Marine Corps veteran who taught her the value of discipline and keeping a cool head, even when everything around you was chaos. Her grandmother, Lorraine, had marched side by side with civil rights protesters in Alabama during the 1960s, teaching Sophia from a young age that true strength wasn't loud or flashy, but steady and patient. Sophia had heard stories her whole life about standing up for what's right, but also about the danger of letting anger lead the way. She remembered her father's advice. You only fight when every other door is closed, and you never give the people trying to hurt you the satisfaction of seeing you break first. The hardest lessons were the ones that stuck with her. She remembered days in school back in Atlanta when defending herself meant a principal's office visit and a mark against her record. There were teachers who saw her as a problem before. They saw her as a person, and classmates who misunderstood her silence as something to mock. So, at Columbia, walking through crowds of students who whispered or stared, Sophia held tight to her promise, never to snap out of turn, never to give away her self-control even if others thought she was weak. Let them think whatever they wanted. She knew she had endured worse than being left out of a group project or sitting alone in a dining hall. Her strength, she realized, was in not showing her cards too soon. People mistook calm for surrender, but to Sophia, self-control was the difference between being brave and being reckless. Most of the kids there had never had to make that kind of choice, and they'd probably never understand why a quiet person was often the strongest one in the room. Behind every time she swallowed her pride or let an insult roll off her back, Sophia was thinking of her family, and every time their choices had protected her or cost her something. If she looked submissive or soft, that was her shield, ready to drop the moment life forced her hand. Until then, she would hold the line, her silence, her strongest answer to every test Columbia and Matthew Sinclair could throw her way. While Sophia's steady quiet unsettled the rest of the campus, it stung Matthew in a way nothing else ever had. He could not shake the feeling that her refusal to take the bait wasn't shyness, but something like open disrespect. To be ignored, or worse, dismissed, was new ground for him, especially in the halls of Columbia, where most students treated him like someone you had to go through, not around. His ego felt bruised every time he tried to get a rise out of her, and was met with nothing but a calm stare or a gentle walk away. This need to reclaim control ate away at him until he reached a point where regular teasing was not enough. Instead of getting bored and moving on, as he usually would, Matthew's thoughts circled back to Sophia by the hour. Soon, he began thinking about what actually mattered to her. It was not her grades or her spot at the back of the classroom. Those were small things. He remembered the denim jacket she wore every Monday, faded but carefully patched in places, and the old bronze locket she kept tucked under her shirt, hints of old family photos, sometimes visible when she leaned forward at her desk. For Matthew, these tokens became the target. If he could knock them down, maybe he could finally get some sort of reaction out of Sophia, a crack in the armor that would prove he still had the upper hand. He figured out her schedule with almost embarrassing attention to detail. Her route from Low Library to Schermerhorn, the paths she took to avoid crowds, the exact time she lingered outside Butler Library before heading off. One drizzly afternoon, when most students were hurrying off to beat the evening rain, Matthew waited in the nearly empty hallway where Sophia usually passed. The place was quiet, just the faint buzz of an old vending machine and the hum of distant voices coming through closed doors. He watched as Sophia turned the corner, her steps slow, headphones in, jacket sleeves pushed up against the damp. Matthew moved deliberately, blocking the corridor in a way that made it clear there would be no easy way around him this time. What he planned was more than a mean joke. It was a statement, an attempt to pull out whatever secret gave Sophia her composure. Matthew was convinced there had to be a limit to her self-control, a boundary he could finally cross if only he found the right thing to press. This was not just about her anymore. Standing there, he felt the weight of his own need to prove who really ruled the quiet corners of Columbia. The collision unfolded so quickly, anyone watching from the end of the hall might have missed the meaning entirely. Matthew, standing firm, waited until Sophia came close, then reached out and yanked the bronze locket from her neck with a single sharp movement. The chain snapped, a quiet metallic sound that echoed in the empty corridor. The locket landed in Matthew's palm, a small but shining thing, and for a second Matthew felt the adrenaline rush he always got from having the upper hand. But the victory was thinner than he had imagined. Sophia stood perfectly, still, her eyes fixed on him. She did not shout, did not flinch with surprise. Her gaze was steady, cold, and so direct that the space around them suddenly felt colder. The distance between them was measured not in steps but in years of history contained in that amulet. Stories of her grandmother's marches, her father's service, the way her family's strength had become quietly woven into her every decision. In that moment, there was no laughter, no audience, nothing to hide behind. All that was left was the raw moment when someone crossed a line that should not have been crossed. The hallway seemed suspended as Sophia regarded Matthew in silence. She did not try to snatch the locket back, nor did she beg for its return. Instead, she simply stared at him, an unbroken line of calm from her generation to his. Matthew, clutching the locket, was stripped of his usual sense of control. For the first time, he was seen by someone who did not believe in his authority, who was not afraid of him, who recognized him for exactly what he was, a person who had just gone too far. Sophia's silence spoke a language more powerful than any words could. In that instant, Matthew felt the heavy truth of her resilience. Suddenly, the need to prove himself evaporated, replaced by something colder and unfamiliar. Shame, or maybe fear, at being truly exposed. While he held the symbol of her strength, he realized he also held the evidence of his own smallness. Time seemed to move slowly as other students started to filter into the hallway, picking up on the tension. Some stopped and stared, sensing this was a turning point they would remember. Sophia's look never faltered, and in that second, the balance in the hall shifted. Matthew was the one caught in the harsh light, finally unsure. finally forced, to see himself through the eyes of another. What happened next caught everyone off guard, not least Matthew. Sophia stepped forward, closing the last bit of space between them, and with quick, practiced movements, she gripped his arm and twisted. It was not violent, just incredibly sure. In one heartbeat, Matthew found himself spun around, his knees buckling under her control, and in the next, he was on the cold tile floor, the breath knocked out of him. The locket tumbled from his hand and landed on the ground between them. For a moment, nobody moved. The quiet was thick, stretching out. Over the students who had gathered to watch, but had been too frozen to do anything except stare. Even those always eager for drama could sense this was different from every blow-up or cafeteria argument that usually fed campus gossip. Sophia did not posture or say anything for attention. She simply bent down, picked up her locket, and stood, tall, showing the same calm as before. She didn't look at Matthew with triumph or anger. She only gave him a steady glance, as if to say she had just drawn a line he would not cross again. The silence after the sound of the impact and the quick gasps from the crowd was almost as loud as a shout. It filled the space with a truth that had been building quietly for weeks, that some people do not need to yell to be heard, and that respect claimed with force is nothing next to the strength of someone who has drawn real lines and stands by them. Matthew stayed down on the floor, all the confidence drained out of him. The students who had been laughing at his jokes now stared at him in a new light, unsure of how to react. A few of them stepped back, suddenly aware there would be no easy way to laugh this off. All the power he had managed to collect over the years felt hollow as he looked up at Sophia, reclaiming her locket. Sophia kept her head high as she walked away. She did not need to say anything more. The message had been delivered, clear as day. She was not someone who could be pushed into a corner, and she did not need anyone's permission to take up space. In her quiet way, she had taken back not only her amulet, but also her right to walk through those halls as her true self. When Matthew finally pulled himself together, the realization hit him hard. There was no crowd rushing to his side, no one ready to stick up for him or comfort his embarrassment. He'd grown used to having people jump in when things went wrong for him, or at the very least, whisper about how unfairly he was treated. This time was completely different. Instead of worried voices or friends trying to smooth things over, the people around him just stood back, looking uncomfortable or quietly turning away as if they already sensed what he was beginning to realize. He was out there on his own, and the feeling was a shock. Sophia, meanwhile, didn't turn her victory into a show. There was no mocking or gloating from her. What she'd done wasn't about payback or making Matthew feel smaller than he already did sprawled on the tile floor. She showed just enough control to set a boundary, nothing more. Her message was simple. Enough was enough, and there were limits you did not cross, no matter who you thought you were. Sophia could have dragged things out. She could have said something sharp to twist the knife further, but she chose not to. Instead, her restraint was what stood out the most, a quiet statement that spoke even louder than what had just happened. For those watching, the memory of Matthew's old power faded fast. The fear that once seemed to leak from Sophia and stick to everyone else had shifted. Now, whenever people caught her eye around campus, there was a different kind of respect there. The old anxiety she used to carry wasn't hers anymore. It had drifted toward Matthew, who finally realized how quickly things could change when someone who never claimed the spotlight finally stood up. What Sophia offered in that moment was not just a show of strength or a step up the social ladder. It was also forgiveness, or at least a warning delivered without cruelty. She'd made it clear that just because someone forgives, it does not mean they will forget. The lesson stuck with everyone who had gathered in the hallway. They saw how someone could draw the line with grace and not with anger, and how sometimes the deepest power is not in breaking someone, but in simply refusing to be broken yourself. It didn't take long for what had happened in the hallway to reach every corner of Columbia. People talked about it in low voices while waiting in line at the campus coffee shop and sent hurried texts during lectures. A few had even managed to catch part of the scene on their phones, and soon those grainy snippets started making the rounds in group chats, spreading the story faster than anyone could keep up. It was the kind of thing that usually got blown out of proportion, but this time there was something about the way it happened and the person at the center of it that made people stop and pay attention. For years, most students had barely noticed Sophia except to steer clear or exchange rumors. She was the quiet one, the girl with the old denim jacket and the serious stare, easy to overlook if you were not paying attention. Now, though, those same people found themselves wondering who she really was. They replayed the video clips, pointed out the steady way she picked up her locket, and shared their own half-true stories about her background and family, most of them wrong, but all feeding into something bigger. The atmosphere on campus changed almost overnight. It was not just that Matthew seemed humbled or that his friends suddenly kept their distance. It was the way students, who had always stayed in the background, especially those who once felt powerless around Matthew, began to look at Sophia differently. She had not started a fight for praise or payback. Her strength was quiet, something you had to see in context to fully understand. A lot of people, especially those who had crossed paths with Matthew before, felt drawn to the calm confidence she showed that afternoon. The air was thick with curiosity, and before long, people who never would have dared to get involved in the past now wanted to know more about the girl who changed the rules without raising her voice. Some of the more timid students found a sense of encouragement, reassured by the idea that you did not have to be loud or aggressive to make a difference. Sophia became something of a quiet legend, a reminder of what could happen when the least likely person refuses to stay invisible any longer. Through all the whispers and the new looks she got in the dining hall, Sophia stayed just as quiet and steady as ever, following her routine, carrying her books and her old bronze locket, and letting the story settle on its own. As the days went on, people started to dig a little deeper into who Sophia actually was. Old trophies from the Columbia athletics program, hidden away in glass cases on the lower floors, caught fresh interest. It turned out Sophia's name appeared more than once on those plaques. Track and field, relay teams, even a citywide tournament. From several years back, all quietly listed among the scribbles and photos of other school legends. Apparently, before she'd started fading into the background, Sophia had made her mark in ways no one around her now had really noticed or remembered. Stories kept surfacing, faster than Sophia could have hoped to avoid them. Someone's older brother told the tale of watching her anchor a relay, coming from behind to clinch a victory, drawing wild cheers from the bleachers. A retired coach dropped hints about her natural discipline and the way she always preferred to keep her head down in practice, never asking for extra attention. It was not just the athletic wins that people whispered about. A few of the professors over in the humanities department remembered that her grandfather had marched alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. during the historic rallies in Washington. Another rumor popped up that her aunt had led a local grassroots campaign for community rights back in the 1980s. All of this new information started painting a completely different picture. It was as if Sophia had been wrapped in a cloak of quiet stories, some half-true, some real, and with each new detail, people's perception of her shifted. No longer was she just the quiet student with the old jacket and the bronze locket she always wore. She became a figure you passed in the hallway and straightened up for, more out of respect than curiosity. Her classmates treated her with a distant sort of awe, not wanting to crowd her or draw too close for fear of breaking that careful silence she still carried. Oddly, as her story became more public, it made her seem even harder to reach. Students might nod or smile when they saw her, but few tried to force a conversation. Where there had once been whispered judgment and awkward avoidance, there was now space, almost a protective bubble around Sophia, built not by her isolation, but by the careful respect her classmates chose to give. The more they learned, the less they felt like they belonged in her circle, and that suited Sophia just fine. She had never wanted the spotlight anyway. All she ever needed was to walk her own line, and now, at last, she could. Meanwhile, Matthew was facing a reality he had never really imagined for himself. It started gradually, a few glances in his direction that slid away, avoiding his eyes, then longer stretches in the cafeteria where nobody waved him over, and eventually an unmistakable gap that opened up around him in every classroom. People who had once laughed along at his jokes or followed his lead as if it were the natural thing to do, now treated him with uncertainty or just plain silence. It was not about fear anymore. It was more like they just did not want to be near him, as if his presence made them uncomfortable. With each passing day, Matthew felt just how quickly things could change. The old crew who would fill the hall with their swagger and laughter drifted away one by one. Those inside jokes and the lunchtime banter that once kept him at the center of attention fell away, until suddenly there was nothing left but empty space where his little kingdom used to be. There was no dramatic confrontation, no fiery arguments, just a quiet, steady withdrawal, like the tide receding after a storm. The humiliation cut deeper every time he saw Sophia passing by. She never looked at him with anger, pity, or even the briefest sign of satisfaction. For Sophia, it seemed the whole thing was barely a footnote, just another obstacle handled and moved past. She did not change her walk across the quad, did not start holding herself differently, and did not let the swirling attention shake her calm. It was this total lack of gloating or triumph that hit Matthew the hardest. He had spent so long thinking that control was everything, but now, seeing that Sophia carried on just as she always had, he realized the real victory was never about topping someone. It was about not needing revenge or recognition at all. There was even more sting in hearing other students talk about how Sophia had handled herself, how she had not tried to embarrass him, and how she had only done what needed to be done. The respect for her only grew stronger, and every time Matthew caught a quiet, respectful nod in her direction, he felt the weight of his own choices all the more. It became obvious that the worst punishment he could face was not exclusion or even ridicule. It was realizing that someone could face down your worst and still walk away without needing to celebrate or hold a grudge. Over time, the quiet that once served Matthew as a tool, one he used to intimidate or control, changed its meaning completely. Instead of people lowering their voices or shifting nervously out of his way, there was just this blankness that followed him everywhere. Eyes slid past him without interest, and conversations continued as if he wasn't even there. It was not the tense silence of fear he had relied on for so long, but a casual, almost dismissive absence, as if he were simply one more face in a crowd. Gone were the days when students gave him wide space in the halls or hung on his every word. Now, if they looked at him at all, it was with a kind of distant courtesy you gave to someone you barely remembered from freshman orientation. It became clear that whatever respect he thought he had earned, or maybe just forced, had crumbled in a single afternoon. Matthew finally understood that you could not hang on to power that was never grounded in anything honest. His arrogance had stripped away the thin layer of awe that kept others in line, and nothing had replaced it. Nobody went out of their way to ignore him or talked behind his back with the brutality he once inflicted. They just moved on. For the first time, he was left with exactly what he had always given others: silence. Meanwhile, Sophia went about her days just as she always had. She never played up the story that had built up around her, did not try to create a group of followers, and made no effort to take on some leadership role left open by Matthew's downfall. She kept to her old routines, sitting at the same weathered table in the campus quad or visiting the small corner store down the street for strong coffee and a half-stale donut. Her old jacket, with its scuffed elbows and deep inside pockets, was as much a part of her as ever. Sophia's quiet confidence set the tone now, not because she wanted that role, but because she respected herself enough to just keep showing up. There was no ceremony or speech about a new order taking the place of the old one. Sophia had never needed the center of attention. By simply living her life with the same patience and steadiness as always, she made it clear to everyone that you do not have to rule over others to be strong. You just need to stand your ground, even when no one else is watching. Sophia never once tried to get the last word. There were no dramatic posts online, no clever captions on those blurry hallway videos, and not a single attempt to spin the story her way. She did not correct the wild rumors about her family or her past, and she ignored the new spotlight that kept flickering in her direction. That, more than anything, threw the whole social scene at Columbia for a loop. People had gotten used to thinking that whoever won stood at the front with everyone else behind them, soaking up the attention. But Sophia broke that pattern, and it left everyone rethinking what counted as real strength. Her choice to simply walk away from the whole mess ended up being what stuck with people most. If she had tried to milk the victory, the usual drama would have played out. People would have picked sides, gossiped for weeks, and tried to prop someone up as the next queen or king of the campus. Instead, Sophia made it clear that she did not need the crowd's approval or anyone's praise. She closed the door on the drama as easily as she had closed so many other doors before, just slipping away to the next part of her day. For a long time, there had been this unspoken belief at Columbia that the loudest person or the biggest personality would always set the rules. Watching Sophia refuse to play the game reminded everyone that you do not always have to meet aggression with more aggression. The loudest showdown was not what mattered in the end. It was the way you carried yourself after things fell quiet. Again, some of the students used to living off conflict, the ones who thrived on picking fights and boosting their own status, suddenly had no idea what to do with themselves. The social food chain, at least for a little while, felt strange and out of balance. Slowly, more people found comfort in this new order, where there was no need for constant drama or one-upmanship. Sophia's example carried through. Standing firm did not mean you had to attack, and defending yourself did not make you ruthless. She showed them that you could face down even your toughest moments without letting grudges or bitterness take over. In the end, the most lasting impression she left behind was not about victory or revenge, but about holding on to what made you human, no matter how hard things got. In the days that followed, Matthew was left to face a version of Columbia he never imagined, a place that suddenly had no special space for him. At first, he tried pretending nothing had changed. He kept his old swagger in the halls, nodded at his former buddies, and sat at his usual spot in the cafeteria. But when no one waved back or even tried to make room at the table, it finally started to hit him. Even the ones who used to hang on his every word seemed to disappear into other circles. The world he had built on attitude, influence, and subtle threats had been swept away and left him stranded. He found himself wandering through the echoing corridors, the noise of other people's conversations, washing over him but never including him. He started to hear the whispers, the ones he could never quite catch, always just behind his back. Sometimes they were about him, sometimes just about how things had changed. Every once in a while, he thought he caught snippets about Sophia, about her calm, her patience, and the way she had ended everything with so little drama. Those passing words underscored the point. He was no longer someone to fear or follow. Matthew tried to reconnect with the few who had stuck close to him before. He sent messages, tried to strike up casual chats, offered rides home, all the old tricks that once smoothed things over, but nothing stuck. Most responded with polite nods or a quick excuse, never more than a minute or two of conversation before they moved on. The more he tried, the more out of place he felt, as if he were visiting a school he no longer belonged to. Even the spot where everything had gone down, the central hallway near the old trophy case, seemed to taunt him every time he passed. For years, it had felt like his turf, a stage where his word carried weight. But now, it was nothing more than another part of the building, busy with footsteps that barely registered he was there. He began to recognize how much his power had relied on others playing along. Without their fear or their quiet agreement, every gesture, every half-hearted attempt at control faded into the background. Matthew could no longer rewrite the mood of a room, guide the energy of a crowd, or even set the terms of a single conversation. His world had shrunk, and for the first time he sensed just how thin the line was between being at the center and standing entirely alone. While Matthew drifted through his days hardly noticed, Sophia's presence started to mean something different to everyone at Columbia, even though that was never her aim. People found themselves watching her, not out of fear or to gossip, but from a kind of quiet respect. Her story had escaped her control a long time ago, but she refused to let it shape who she became. She kept her head down, stuck to her routines. And when students peppered her with questions in the hallway or tried to pull her into the spotlight, Sophia always handled it with remarkable calm. She would give a nod, maybe offer a short answer, and then guide the conversation somewhere else, making it clear she was not there to soak up attention. Part of what made her stand out was how she never seemed to play by the usual rules. The key student council tried to include her in their public projects, hoping that having Sophia and her newly earned reputation on board would draw more people in. She politely turned down any invitation that made her a token or a symbol. No matter what, Sophia acted on her own terms, always firm and grounded, never showy or out to prove anything. Little by little, her attitude started to change the atmosphere around campus. Some students realized that taking up space did not mean you had to be the loudest voice in the room, and speaking your mind did not need to come with a performance. Even the administration took notice. Instead of planning a campaign about unity, with big assemblies and loud messages, a few professors quietly shifted how they ran their classes, making space for genuine listening and encouraging students to let actions speak as loudly as words. Sophia's way of handling the invasive curiosity after everything played out, her habit of redirecting conversations or stepping aside from offers meant only to boost someone else's image, made her stance even clearer. She was not interested in conquest, approval, or authority. She just wanted to move through her days with self-respect, setting an example without ever calling attention to herself. Somehow, that quiet steadiness struck a deeper chord than any pep rally or public campaign ever could. After witnessing Sophia, more students came away with the sense that it was not how hard you shouted, but how firmly you stood by your values that really challenged and changed the system everyone thought would never budge. The next morning, the air around Columbia High felt charged in a way nobody could quite explain, like the quiet that comes right before a big change. There was no more background buzz about some scandal or tension brewing in the halls, just this thick, heavy pause, filled with the kind of recognition that settles in after everyone has finally understood the same hard truth. Matthew, who only weeks before would have owned the hallways with his easy swagger, moved quietly now. He kept his eyes low, clutching his books close to his chest, weaving through groups that barely shifted to let him pass. The students who might once have sent him nervous glances or hurried out of his way now just watched, open and unblinking, as he slipped by. It was clear to everyone that things did not have to be the way they had been, and suddenly the fear he depended on was gone. Sophia, for her part, did not break from her usual routine. She arrived early, walked her regular route through the main building, and calmly settled into her seat near the window in homeroom, the morning light spilling across her desk. There was no fanfare, and she never looked around to see who noticed her arrival. Still, those who caught sight of her could not help but pause, just for a second, to acknowledge her. The looks she received now were not about curiosity or gossip, but something quieter and deeper, like a silent thanks or a nod you give to someone who taught you an important lesson without ever saying a word. And yet, there was nothing showy about the change. Nobody stood up to make a speech about what had happened, and nobody tried to turn Sophia into a figurehead or leader she never wanted to become. The rules of the place had shifted, not because someone took power, but because the old way had simply been allowed to end. Matthew's silent journey through the halls served as a reminder of how things once were. Sophia's steady presence was proof of the new possibility of moving forward. There were no banners or victory parties, only a quiet promise shared in glances and gentle nods that the school had found a stronger kind of order. This was a change that would last, not because it was forced, but because everyone there had felt it was finally time. As time settled in after those first few days, the story of what happened between Sophia and Matthew wove itself quietly into the life of Columbia High. It became less about gossip and more about the feeling that settled into every classroom and every lunchtime chat under the big oak tree in the courtyard. People realized that strength did not always show up in shouts or big dramatic actions. Sophia's influence was in all the spaces she left unfilled. She did not try to control or seek attention. Instead, she acted only when it was absolutely needed, when every line had been crossed and no one else would step in. That choice showed everyone something about real power, the kind that does not turn anyone into a bully or a victim. In her refusal to play the old games, Sophia held on to what mattered most, her sense of fairness and the dignity to keep quiet, even when others wanted a show. That decision echoed in ways that rules or speeches never could. Teachers let the lessons breathe more in their classes. Students started speaking up for each other, sometimes just with a glance or a steady shake of the head when things felt like they were tipping too far. There was a new confidence in the way kids stood up for themselves and backed one another, not with loud declarations, but with simple acts that made the school a little safer for everyone. Matthew, on the other hand, had to reckon with the mark left by what had happened. His name was no longer followed by nervous glances or whispers of fear. It came with the knowledge, heavy and inescapable, that you could spend years building up a reputation, only for one honest, brave moment from someone else to wipe it all away. It was a lesson that stayed with him every day, a reminder that power based on fear was always brittle and could break in less than 10 seconds if the right person decided to finally push back. And for the rest of the students, the change stuck in subtle but important ways. They understood now that silence itself could be powerful, not the kind used to hide or avoid, but the kind wrapped around purpose and respect. It meant learning that sometimes just standing firm, without shouting, could rewrite the whole story of a place. At Columbia High, that memory, short as it was, kept teaching them long after the moment had passed.